The Shadow People. Written and read by Huw Carr. Destiny had been knocking at the door for over a minute when Benjamin finally answered it. Normally she was too shy to go uninvited to someone's home, but the voice inside her head was insistent. No one had seen Benjamin for weeks. The door opened only a crack at first, so she could see his pale skin framed in shadow, his glassy eye that peered out wide and black. When he opened the door fully, his face was thin and gaunt. Dark hollows showed on his cheeks and around his eyes, which, though he was clearly deathly tired, were wild with torment. He mumbled something inaudible before his face broke into a wretched expression of childlike terror and desperate relief to see her.
I thought it would never be morning again,"
he managed to say before he was crying miserably. Destiny followed Benjamin to where he collapsed on his rough, bedraggled sofa. For some time, he was inconsolable. Slowly, his frightened sobs gave way to a painful, embarrassed silence. She wasn't used to seeing Benjamin like this. Ever since she adopted him as her local do-good project, she had been working by degrees to overcome his shyness of contact. He had been grateful of her visits, she was sure, but they were always tinged with the strange, unexplainable ill-ease that came from him, a haunting watchfulness that built until he would usher her out again. After such a meeting, she would fail to see him about the village for days, sometimes weeks. He was always quiet, always distant. Yet with this outpouring of hidden grief and terror, Destiny could feel a new door was opening into Benjamin's reclusive life, and for the first time, she wondered if it was wise to step into it. She had first met him shortly after she had had to move house. She had always felt more at home with animals than people. You could look into a dog or a cat's eyes and know what they were thinking. You could see their love, or fear, or hunger. They did not hide their thoughts like the eyes of people did. You never really knew where those thoughts were going or coming from. Animal eyes showed there was no darkness deep inside them. She liked to be surrounded by the reassuring eyes of her animals. Her neighbors had complained enough times about the menagerie of strays and rescued injured animals that she kept in the backyard and in the house that the council had taken action. Because she did not have council approval for running an animal rescue, the animals had been taken away from her. Then the landlord had stepped in, and she had been evicted. When she had last found a rental she could afford, it was strictly no pets. This had half killed her inside, but she had no choice. It was that or the streets. Still, once she had settled in her new home, empty of the warmth and love of animal companions, she had gone out into the streets looking for any who looked lonely, hungry, or in need of her. Instead, she had found Benjamin. He had looked to her like a dog without a home. Though she guessed him to be in his early 40s, he was prematurely gray. His eyes were protruding and large, with prominently sagging bags beneath that gave him the look of a bloodhound. Now they were wide and full of the terror of a hunted prey.
I thought I'd gotten away. I thought I had fixed it. But they came again in the night,
he was saying.
Who came?
Destiny asked. Her eyes flicked to his small, cold kitchenette. She wondered if she should make him a cup of tea to help calm him. As soon as she moved slightly in that direction, he began to tremble again, as if her immediate presence was the only thing that was keeping him together. His long, fingered hands covered his face as he said,
The shadow people.
The room in which she stood was full of shadows. Only a tiny slither of light escaped between drawn curtains. Destiny opened her mouth several times to fill the silence that followed his words, but she found there was nothing she could say that didn't sound either foolish or mocking. Yet she knew that you often didn't have to say anything when you were with an injured or scared creature. Her patience was her strength. Sure enough, Benjamin began to speak.
I want you to know that I understand how crazy it sounds. But you know I'm not one of those crazies that stand in the park or at the bus stop screaming about aliens or the Illuminati or whatever shit people think is out there but isn't. For years I've just thought I had an illness, that I was seeing things.
Benjamin's hands fell by his sides, and his head plopped back and lolled against the sofa, as if his neck had suddenly broken. His protuberant eyes fixed at a point on the ceiling and did not move. As he spoke, the tremble began to dissipate from his voice until he became lost in his retelling.
I've been seeing a therapist,
he began quietly.
It's twice a week now. She thinks I'm coming to a breakthrough. I started to believe her. I thought I was too. She thinks that what I've been seeing all this time is a manifestation of something I'm not facing inside. For weeks and weeks we've been poring over my life. How my parents treated me, how I was at school, my problems in my teens, how my marriage broke up, all this shit. She thinks what I've been seeing is because of something in my past. I almost believed it.
Taking the only other chair in the room, Destiny brought it close to where Benjamin sat. She placed it close enough to be in his vision, but not so directly in front of him that he would feel trapped. She quietly sat and slipped her hands together between her knees.
You know you can tell me anything you think you need to. I'm here for you.
She smiled what she hoped was a reassuring smile. His eyes broke away from the spot he was focusing on and fixed on her. He seemed to study her, almost as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. He nodded.
I have to tell someone,
he said with sudden determination.
The therapist, she gets paid to listen, but doesn't really care about the truth of what I'm saying. To her it's all just symbols and repressed urges and Jungian crap. I don't think for 1 second she's just listened as if what I am saying is real. But it's real. People need to know it's real. They worry about their jobs and if they can get a date and whether they should use plastic straws or stay away from GM foods. God, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. They have to understand that all of that doesn't matter. The only thing that really, really matters is that they are there. They are waiting.
He was silent for some time. For long moments he barely moved. Destiny began to feel she was looking at a corpse. She waited for him to move and break this illusion. As the seconds passed, the sensation began to grow on her that she was alone in a dirty room with a dead man, and even though he was dead, the room did not feel empty. Something was watching. When he sucked in breath suddenly, she jumped.
Yes, they're waiting. Even now. They're not far enough away. I never feel they are far away now. They're very close. I used to think they were afraid of light and I was safe during the day. I can feel them, almost see them during the day.
Who? Destiny asked.
The shadow people,
he said in a dead voice. Outside, something passed by and cast a grey light over the room, dimming it and intensifying the dark corners. Benjamin smiled, a sickly smile.
I just used to think I was anxious, you know. I just thought I was half seeing things out of the corner of my eyes, like a vague threat. Like someone might be going to mug me or beat me up because I've always looked like an easy target. I used to be married, you know. I used to have a job. For a little time, I was happy. I first saw them clearly at work during the day.
He tugged at the small tuft of unshaved hair under his lower lip.
I used to work in graphic design. I mostly did sketches of houses and buildings for architects, you know. My signature style was I used to draw silhouettes of people in the window. You wouldn't notice them if you were glancing at the whole picture, but if you studied it, you would enjoy seeing all the details of the shapes in the windows. But I wasn't sleeping well. I began to wake up feeling afraid. Then, one day at work, I was drawing the people shapes in the windows, but not really paying attention. And I stopped and looked at what I had drawn. It was hunched and horribly elongated and thin. And then it moved.
Benjamin swallowed, and his jaw clamped. It took him an effort to open it and begin speaking again.
I saw it move as clear as day. I pushed myself away from the desk and fell back, and then out of the corner of my eyes I saw someone come to the corner of the room. I thought someone had heard me fall and was coming to help, but they said nothing. I turned and looked. It was there, in the door, what I had drawn. A tall, hunched and elongated thing. It was black. It looked like I was looking into a hole. But where the head was, I could see 2 points of even deeper black. 2 eyes, but like eaten out holes into total nothingness. All I could do was scream. Apparently no one could stop me screaming until an ambulance came. That was the first time I went to therapy. The first of many. None of them could stop the shadow people coming to me, though. I thought that was the only time I'd seen them during the day. Mostly, it's when I wake up in the night and they're there. Even if I leave the lights on when I go to sleep, as I always do, when I wake up, it's dark. And they are there.
His whispered tones changed as he shifted position. The light had strengthened outside again. He turned his face to stare into it, unblinking.
My new therapist is very fixated on the school I went to in my early teens. I thought she was right, too, that was where it all began. She said I had been, how did she put it, violated there, and was too young to realise it. When you're a kid, you think everything a grown-up does is normal. You don't have the experience to see. So the school was like a nutty religious one, yeah? We used to have what were supposed to be Bible classes, but what they really were horror stories. I found out much later that the Bible teacher had been in a car accident that killed his wife and one of his kids, and then he had suffered some brain trauma. That was shortly before he started at the school. Maybe he was really entirely insane. Maybe that's why he always looked like he could see the devil creeping round outside looking for us. He used to sit there in that horrible classroom on a table, facing us, and tell us all about rock stars and film stars who had given themselves over to the devil for fame and success. And all of them had died, debased, choking on their own vomit. Bon Scott from AC/DC, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin's drummer John Bonham. Every lesson there was a new horror tale to tell us of those who gave way to Satan's power and let the devil tear them apart from the inside. I used to go to sleep every night afraid. The devil could get into any of us. Some nights I just didn't go to sleep. Then one day I was in class, half out of my mind because I was so tired, and he was going on and on and on about the devil. I just wanted him to stop. I couldn't take the stories anymore. His horrible face at the front of the class, spit trembling on his lips, as he seemed to savour every word about how we were all in danger.
Benjamin's arms encircled his chest and began hugging himself tightly.
I cracked. It was like I didn't know I was going to do it. I stood up and I meant to shout at him. I wanted to tell him he was meant to teach us, not terrify us so much that we couldn't sleep at night. But all that came out of my mouth was this howling shriek. The more I tried to control it, the more it sounded like it wasn't me. I was screaming and howling, and then I heard him crying out, the devil's in him. And before I knew what was happening, he was dragging me to the ground. Everyone in the class was around me. Everyone was terrified and looking down at me. He yelled and called on Jesus, and then he began shoving his fingers into my mouth. His fingers smelled of dirt and old cheese. I could feel I was going to vomit. No one helped me. No one stopped him. A full-grown man was on top of a boy and shoving his stinking fingers in his mouth, and all everyone could do was wonder if the devil was going to come out of me and get into one of them. And I was wondering why Jesus wasn't helping me. All the while I could see his picture on the wall. It was the only thing I could say. Jesus, help me!
He laughed bitterly.
That was the magic word. He hauled me up onto my feet and hugged me and told the whole room that Jesus had saved me from the devil that had got inside. And then everyone was hugging me and I was the centre of it all, and after my terror, the hugs seemed to be worth it. But my therapist, when I told her this and she made me remember what it was like, I remembered looking up at the teacher as he held me down and his fingers choking me, and I remembered something. There was a shape behind him, a horrible, thin and elongated shadow shape. She made me see that I had seen them before.
When he stopped, Destiny realized that she had also been clasping herself tightly. She tried to adjust herself into a position that did not display the sense of horror he had wrought inside her. It had wound her up within like a coiled spring.
So I went back to the school last week,
he continued flatly.
I broke into that classroom at night. I stood there in that room surrounded by the dark, and I destroyed it. I smashed the chairs and got on the desk and jumped on them till they broke. I smashed the teacher's chair until it was only shards. And then I took that same Jesus painting off the wall and I impaled it on the shards. Then I stood there in the dark and told my shadows I'd let them out. They could fuck off now and leave me alone. They had ruined everything. Fear of them had ruined my job. My wife hated that I would always let my fear of them defeat me. She left me. For a time she'd been my only defense. When she told me they wouldn't come, I believed her and I could sleep. But she left me. The stupid shadows drove her away. Well, I had found where they had first begun to fuck up my life and I destroyed it. I took control. I thought I had.
He shuddered with the passion of the event.
I went home. I felt good. I didn't care if I'd get caught. I'd driven all the way home and I hadn't seen one shadow running along beside the car. I walked inside through the dark into a dark house and I felt nothing there. I can't tell you the sense of burden that seemed to have lifted. I just wanted to sing and dance in the night. The stars were out and I suddenly realized how beautiful the dark could be. I didn't even turn on any lights. I just fell into my bed with a stupid smile on my face and fell instantly asleep.
The room dimmed again. Benjamin's long fingers slid into his grey hair and perched on either side of his temples like giant, malignant spiders.
I woke up in the night and I couldn't move,
he panted in a weak voice.
My whole body was rigid. I could barely draw a breath. I panicked, thinking I was paralyzed. Yet even in that second I knew. At first I could not hear them. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness of the room and you could see everything in a kind of grey light. The deepest shadows were swirling, making those shapes, you know? What happens when your brain can't work out exactly what it's seeing and it tries to make sense of the dark? I remember thinking this. I was trying to convince myself, don't worry. I just kept saying it over and over. But it was pointless. Even as I was doing it, I knew. I was just trying to stop myself from seeing what I knew was there. There was one in the corner of the room. When my eyes first distinguished it, it was crouching. It was immensely fat and a sickening broad shape like an enormous toad. But then it stood up from the crouch and instantly became tall and willowy. It was as absurdly tall, so much that it had to lean forward to allow the upper part of the body to fit in the room. Its arms seemed to span out and circle around the room, like a crab holding out its claws. For a moment it stayed in the corner, swaying slowly, not coming any closer. Then I heard a low, distorted, buzzing sound, almost like an old radio. All I could move was my eyes. I shifted them to what seemed to be the source of the buzzing sound, and there, standing perfectly still and straight, was another shadow person. I tried to scream out. I tried to pull myself up off the bed. The second shadow person barked out a terrifying sound, but it wasn't directed at me. Somehow I knew it was calling to the swaying one. An instant later, it raced across the room like an insane stick insect. But it was huge and heavy. It was on my chest now, crushing me down. I could barely breathe. That's when I could feel tears flowing from my eyes. The thin, elongated head swiveled down towards me on the fragile snake-like neck. The face was so close to my face. It was utterly dark. But then, two holes of darkness formed, two eyes, and I could see something in them. It moved closer. Its eyes seemed to be falling back into its head, but falling so far back the holes were deep, miles deep maybe. And even while the holes grew deeper, I saw something blacker than black crawling in those holes, crawling and twisting. First I thought they were fat fingers clasped together. Then I thought they were bloated maggots trying to burrow their way into one another. My chest felt like it was cracking under the weight. From the second shape that still stood in the far corner, the buzzing smoothed out and became words I could understand. "You did well," it said. It said it again and again.
He shuddered.
Then the face in front of me spoke. It was higher, but so much more frightening, right next to my face. I could tell there were words, but they were so much harder to understand. It said the same thing again and again. The pain in my body, crushed by its weight, was becoming impossible to bear. My heart began to throb, and a sharp, agonizing shock ripped through my body. I'm having a heart attack, I thought. Then I heard the voice. "Let go," it said, as clear as day. "Let go. Let go."
A floorboard creaked from behind Destiny. She turned suddenly, fearing that someone was creeping up to seize her. When she span her head to look back over her shoulder, all she saw were the motes of dust swirling in the light from the small window of the kitchenette. She turned back towards Benjamin.
"Sleep paralysis,"
she said. She found her mouth was very dry. Benjamin said nothing and stared at her without expression.
"When we dream, we're paralyzed. Our body does it to stop us acting out our dreams. I've heard it's possible for people to wake up in that dream state. You are awake, but still dreaming. That explains the feeling of being paralyzed. Of course it's frightening, and because we're frightened and still dreaming, our imagination creates a dream, or a nightmare rather, that fits being paralyzed."
Shaking his head, Benjamin said in a calm voice,
"That's what my doctor and my psychiatrist and everyone else who doesn't want to admit they are guessing says. So if that's really true, if it was just a wiring mistake or a chemical imbalance of the brain, monitor my sleep. It's easy. Diagnostically detect the part of my brain that's going wrong. Only they can't. Hundreds of tests have been performed around the world on people who see shadow people, and what do they find? Nothing. Oh yeah, I've talked online with dozens of people who've experienced it. I'm not one single hallucinating crazy person. It's a phenomenon that transcends nations and cultures, religions and creeds."
Destiny smiled apologetically.
"I don't think you're crazy,"
she said softly.
"but I can see you don't believe me. So you think I'm either deluded, lying, or mad."
She didn't reply. His gaze had become so intense that she dropped her eyes.
"Or,"
he continued,
"you do in part believe, but you can't bring yourself to accept it's possible. In the real world, there's only sunlight and electricity and church on Sunday, and that world doesn't have space for monsters in the dark. Well, sunlight deforms your cells. Electricity can make dead things twitch. The people in your church are wearing masks. They say, 'We love you, Jesus, meek and mild,' to one another's face. Then they go home and crave the coming of Armageddon. So all the unbelievers will get what's coming to them. And then the pastor is wondering how to hide church funds sufficiently to pay for the next time he wants to fuck his favourite underage rent boy. Aren't all those things truly monstrous? Is it hard to believe that there are worse monsters than those that are easy to see?"
Destiny crossed her arms defensively over her breasts. She had never felt the slightest threat from him before, but his eyes seemed suddenly alive and hungry, and he had planted an image of her pastor in her mind that suddenly made her question the photo on his office wall of the boys' club that he sponsored.
"You mentioned Jung before," she said swiftly. "You meant the philosopher. Was it Carl Jung?" "Yeah, Carl Jung," he replied.
He continued to sit forward, and his eyes locked on her.
What does he have to do with the fear?
He grunted.
Not much. Only a name, perhaps. I think Jung's idea of the shadow is just a symbol. He never meant it as a real, like a physical thing. It isn't a real thing like the shadow people. Jung's shadow can't come in the night and scare you half to death. As far as I've read, Jung used a metaphor to describe how we are unaware of things that drive us from our subconscious mind. Someone who is controlled by their shadow self is not aware of why they keep making stupid mistakes, falling into the same traps, or seeming to destroy things they love. It's the part of us that wants to destroy things?
Destiny asked. In many ways, Benjamin seemed to her to be cutting himself off from life. She feared that he was retreating so far that eventually he would withdraw from living altogether. The monsters crushing him seemed the perfect analogy for that, and his fear of them proved that he actually wanted to be free of his disconnection and isolation.
No, he replied. It's the desires and intentions that we repress because we don't want them to be seen in the light of our life, especially by others. Like the person who's so obsessed with being a moral and decent person, pointing out the flaws and failings in others all the time, that they totally fail to realize that they themselves are cruel, judgmental, and intolerant. You could say, my shadow has wanted for years to take revenge on my teacher, and that's why I smashed up the classroom. My shadow is the part of me that loves to destroy things. And that is precisely why I know the shadow people are not that. My therapy has been making me aware of my hidden self, my own personal shadow self. You would think if my subconscious mind was now aware that I was seeking to understand my shadow self, or merge with it, as the Jungian psychology suggests, that these manifestations would begin to take on a different form. I should not be frightened of meeting my subconscious self. Like when you go to sleep afraid or worried, you have tormented dreams, but when you go to sleep happy, contented, and feeling in control, you have blissful dreams. As I said, I've been doing a lot of research. Jung's beliefs don't match what I'm experiencing, and it certainly can't explain the community-wide experiences, like the Papa Bawa in Tanzania. The Papa what?
Destiny asked.
Papa Bawa. It's the name for the shadow people on the island of Pemba off the coast of Tanzania. There, they assault whole families, seemingly moving from house to house. What is different there is that people tell one another of the attacks to warn them, and it seems the more people that know, the greater the freedom the shadow people have to attack. People there walk around with talismans made from pages of the Quran. Not that that does them any good, apparently. Now, Jung's shadows can't explain the Papagawa or the things that attack me in the night, because Jung's shadows are just phantoms of thought. The shadow people are real and tangible. They have physical weight. And think about it, they're totally and utterly black. When things are black, not just in shadow because there's no light, but actually really deep black, it means that they're absorbing the full light spectrum. That means they must have a type of physical body. That means they're detectable. We could detect them.
As Benjamin continued to stare unblinkingly at her, a small, mirthless smile appeared on his face.
I've known for some time now that the only way to combat them is for people to know they exist. Now I come to think of it, I guess I am inspired a bit by Jung, bringing the shadow out into the open. So I've finally scraped up enough money to buy a webcam, and it's got night vision. I'm going to put the computer on my bedside table so the camera can view me and the wall where they appear from. I'm in a support group online on Discord that's going to watch the camera feed while I sleep. I felt them close. They'll come. I'm sure of it. They'll come tonight.
The burning gaze in Benjamin's eyes finally smoldered and went out. He was again the frightened and half-wizened man she'd seen at the door.
Please,
he said, as his voice began to shake again.
You live so close. Please stay up one night, that's all I ask. I've wanted to ask you for days now, but I've been so afraid. They feel like they're waiting for me. The bushes outside seem to be always moving, as if they're hiding there, not entirely ready to step out in the daylight. Not yet, but they are close to it. Something is giving them the courage to, or the strength. Can you stay up one night and watch? And if you see anything, come around.
And what might he do? She found herself suddenly wondering. When she wandered into his dark home in the depth of the night, before when his eyes had been staring at her, she had felt he was stripping away the thin dress she wore and leaving her naked. Naked and alone in his strange, cold, and somehow oppressive house. She clamped her knees fully together and swallowed.
I guess I could tonight?
Could he hurt her? Now he seemed to have turned back into the lost bloodhound. The look of relief on his face was washing away the memory of the ravenous look she thought she had seen. Or was that a manifestation of her own shadow self? She had never had a boyfriend, keeping herself in the company of dumb and sexless animals.
Thank you,
he said. Destiny promised herself that whatever happened, she was not going to come over in the night. In her bed, Destiny joined the Discord server and watched the grey image of Benjamin sleeping in his bed. Occasionally, one of the 5 or 6 others in the group made a comment in the nearby chat. Some thought they had seen movement on the corners of the camera's vision, but Destiny believed they were jumping at shadows. As soon as she thought those words, she smiled bleakly. Now that it was night, the sense that the world was familiar and rational began to melt away. Thoughts that she could easily laugh away in the daylight began to plague her and rob her of certainty. From the darkest recesses of her mind, dark thoughts began to find ways out of their locked cages. Benjamin had never before seemed to show any interest in her, other than an uneasy friendship. She sometimes wondered if he even noticed that she was a woman. That was why the hungry stare in his eyes had ripped away her lack of fear of being alone with him. Was she imagining it? Other men often made her feel like she was prey to their only barely hidden lusts, but never Benjamin, until now. What was she thinking he might do? After all, there would be too many people watching for him to... Despite the multiple blankets she had piled on herself against the cold, she shivered. The dark thoughts crawled closer. Could he really do something like that? Was it to be a show in front of everyone watching? Her heart began to hammer. She looked at the icons representing the other people who were watching. Now began to notice how each image that the users had chosen had a dark undertone. Pictures of sorcerers, witches, and malevolent creatures. In her mind's eye, she saw each of them staring hungrily at the screen, waiting for the moment they had been told was coming, when she would arrive innocent and unsuspecting and find not a helpless, paralyzed man facing imagined demons, but a cunning and dangerous predator already naked beneath his sheets. Destiny turned her face away from the screen. She woke with a start, feeling that something was in her room. As Destiny blinked her eyes into wakefulness, she looked around. The insipid light of the early morning outlined the grime in the flock wallpaper and obscured the image on her open laptop. The laptop. The reason that it was open and running overnight raced back into her conscious mind. She grabbed the screen and shifted it so she could clearly see the feed still coming from Benjamin's bedroom. At first, she thought the bed was empty. She breathed out a sigh of relief that assailed her rising guilt that she had fallen asleep and not been attending the vigil as she had promised. The door to his bedroom was open. He would probably be in the front part of the unit, making tea or perhaps having breakfast. Then her eyes were drawn to the outline of something long beneath the half-thrown-off sheets along the end corner of the bed. Destiny stared at it for some time, trying to make sense of the shape. With a sudden intake of breath, she realized that she could make out the joint of a knee and the line of the shin and foot. Someone was lying on the floor beside the bed, out of view, with one leg draped over the corner. Instantly, her eyes darted to the chat window beside the video feed. 8 people had been watching as he slept. At around 2 a.m, the text had become increasingly concerned and at last hysterical. Someone had written,
"God, what was that? Did you see that?"
"Look at him, I think it's happening,"
wrote another.
"There's something there, in the corner."
"Jesus, what's
Oh my
that?"
God, I can't believe this. I can see the entity.
Benjamin, wake up!
"Get out of there, man!"
God, what's happening to him? Can someone call the cops?
Where does he live?
Does anyone know where he lives? I've got screen record on.
Around at Benjamin's door, she found he had not left it unlocked. She hammered on it, hoping he would wake up. She did not leave for 10 minutes. She kept calling until her throat was hoarse. Returning home, she checked the monitor again. Then she called for an ambulance. For part of the time, she watched the ambulance workers and later the police over the transmitting webcam until it was shut off. Later in the day, when the police came to interview her, she already knew that Benjamin was dead. She had seen them removing the body. For one fleeting moment, she had had a glimpse of his staring face. He had died in absolute terror. Part of her was too frightened to seek out an explanation for how he died, yet she found herself that evening contacting the person who had written in the chat that they had recorded the live video from the Discord group feed. The man provided a link to his YouTube page where he had uploaded a portion of the recording. The video was entitled, "Proof: Shadow People Caught on Webcam." She watched it. There was Benjamin, lying in bed. He jolted in his sleep. He woke, even in the poor lighting. She could see his staring eyes. And then, from the corner of the room, the wall seemed to crack. A thick, black ribbon of darkness split along the surface, as if an earthquake had shattered the wall. But it wasn't a crack. The next moment proved that. Cracks don't stretch out long, bone-thin black arms. Cracks don't peel away from the wall and walk over to the bed. Cracks don't cause the paralyzed sleeper to shudder and foam at the mouth. Cracks don't make them buckle and bend horribly until they fall out of view. Cracks don't turn and peer at the camera. Shadows. Not shadows now, said a soft, horribly familiar voice. Destiny began to shake. The cold, inhuman voice had not come from behind her or beside her. It had come from her own lips. Inside, the crawling thoughts from the darkness unlocked their cage. Her arms reached out in front of her, extending her fingers, luxuriating in their grasp. Destiny watched in horror. She was not moving her hands. She could not feel them. With every breath that came, she felt less. Body, her lips said. As the shadowed veil between her conscious and unconscious mind fell, she realized the truth. For millennia we had sought to understand the shadow inside. We had grappled to shine light on what we thought of as our unconscious selves. We saw ourselves as agents of body and action, seeking to understand our hidden, shadowed drives. All the time we sought, we never thought that the opposite was possible. That they, the shadow people, creatures of total awareness, strove to grasp what eluded them. All the time they had been only thoughts, lost in their world of darkness, seeing only glimpses of light in the shared realm we entered when we sleep. Just as we have striven to unlock what we have called our subconscious, we lacked control of our hidden drives and desires because they were in shadow. They, the shadows, lacked one thing only. A living body to drive.
Hi, this is Huw Carr. Thank you for listening to my original story, The Shadow People. If you enjoyed this story, please jump on your favorite social media page and share it with your friends. Tell them why you liked it. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to push that notification bell. As always, look out for the shadows.